In this video, we are going to be going over order of operations, but we're just going to be adding in absolute value with it. And I only talked about absolute value in the very beginning of this course, all the way in section 1.1, which is the very first video. So I'm going to do a little bit of a review with absolute value and what it means before we start using it with operations. So recall that absolute value is the distance a number is from 0. And also know that the absolute value of any number is always positive. You will never have the absolute value of something be negative. So with that being said, let's first look at example 1. So example 1, we have the absolute value of -4. So I'm going to write out how to say that out loud. So to say this out loud, that is the absolute value of negative 4. So, not -4, I apologize. Because we don't have a -4, it's just 4. Absolute value of 4. Okay, so we have absolute value of 4. And 4, we have to think about how far 4 is away from 0. So let's draw out a quick number line. This is 0, and this is 4. So we have to think, how far is this distance between 0 and 4? And in that case, 4 is 4 units away from 0. So the absolute value of 4 is just 4. And looking at example 2, we're going to look, this is going to be, let me draw it this way, because we're now in the negatives. We're now in the negatives. So this is going to be 0. Let's say this is -4. And now we have to think, what is the distance between -4 and 0? And this distance here is still 4 units. So the absolute value of -4 is still 4. And the reason why absolute value specifically is always positive, that is because you can never have a negative distance. Because if you have a negative distance, that means it doesn't exist. So that's why absolute value is always positive. So the absolute value of 4 and -4, that's why they're the same. Because the distance between the two, or the distance of 4 to 0 is 4, and the distance of -4 to 0 is 4. Okay, so with this next example, example 3, we have to be careful here, because now this negative sign is on the outside of this absolute value of 4. So this negative sign is not inside the absolute value bars. So therefore, we're going to have to bring this negative out front, because this negative is not inside the absolute value bars like it is here. So this negative is being multiplied by the absolute value of 4. It's not the absolute value of -4. It's negative 1 times the absolute value of 4. So if it helps you could always also write a -1 here. Or you can write parentheses like I did before. Whatever helps you visualize that this negative is not within these absolute value bars. So we're going to bring out this negative, and as we've seen before in example 1, the absolute value of 4 is just 4. So example 3 equals -4. Okay, so now with that practice and review, let's work through some problems. So whenever you're doing operations with an absolute value bars, just think of absolute value bars as a new way, or a new type of parentheses. So let me say up here, let's do it as in red. Let's start. Treat absolute value bars like parentheses. So, with that being said, let's look at example 4. We have 14, the absolute value of 14 minus 7. So all we have to do here is find what 14 minus 7 is. And 14 minus 7 is 7. So we now have the absolute value of 7. And we have to think now what the absolute value of 7 is. So the distance between 0 and 7 is just 7. So that's our answer. Looking at example 5, we have the absolute value of 17 plus 3 minus the absolute value of 4 minus 6. So remember I said treat absolute value bars like parentheses. So here we're going to have to do that. So we're going to have to first do 17 plus 3 and then do 4 minus 6. So 17 plus 3 is 20. And don't forget those absolute value bars. I'm going to erase these parentheses here so we don't get confused. And then we're going to have minus, and then 4 minus 6 is negative 2. And we're going to bring out those absolute value bars. So now, because we have the absolute value 20, because they're just two separate numbers, or they're just one, we just have one number in it, our absolute value bars, we can now find the absolute value of these numbers. So we can find the absolute value of 20 and find the absolute value of negative 2. And the absolute value of 20 is going to be 20. And the absolute value of negative 2, remember, absolute value is always positive. So this is going to be a positive 2. So we have 20 minus 2, which is 18. And that is our answer. Looking at example 6, we have an absolute value within an absolute value, but don't let that stress you out. Because remember, we are just treating this absolute value like parentheses. But in this case, right, this absolute, we don't have any operations within it. So what it's asking us to do first is we have to find the absolute value of negative 4. And then once we find the absolute value, then we can square this 4. So when we do that, we're going to get the absolute value of 5 minus the absolute value of 4 is just 4. So we get 5 minus 4 squared. And then we're going to close those brackets, close those absolute value bars. And then we're going to have the absolute value of negative 3 in the denominator. And now from here, let's simplify our numerator. So we're going to get 5 minus 16 over the absolute value of negative 3. And then from here, 15 minus 16, that is going to be negative 11. Absolute value of negative 11, I have the absolute value of negative 3. So absolute value of negative 11, that is 11. And the absolute value of negative 3 is 3. And that's our final answer. Looking at example 7, we have 4 times the absolute value of negative 3 minus 2 minus the absolute value of 2 divided by 2. So I encourage you to pause the video and try this on your own. And assuming you have worked through it, let's go through it together. So we have 4 times, so let's remember we always treat absolute value like parentheses. So we're going to have to first do negative 3 minus 2. Negative 3 minus 2 is 5. So we have 4 times the absolute value of negative 5. And then we're going to subtract 2 divided by 2, which is 1. So we have minus the absolute value of 1. The absolute value of negative 5 is 5. So we're going to say that's 4 times 5. And the absolute value of 1 is just 1. So we have 4. So then now, let's do this multiplication first, because we have subtraction over here. So we're going to do 4 times 5, which is 20. And then we're going to subtract 1, and 20 minus 1 is 19. And then looking at example 8, we have 35 minus this term in parentheses, which is 4 plus 12 times the absolute value of 7 minus 4. So in this case, we have parentheses. We have absolute value within parentheses. But remember, as we've seen in the previous section, when we did order of operations, we dealt with some problems where we had parentheses within parentheses. Now, when this happens, remember we did what the innermost parentheses first. So we're going to do this absolute value. We're going to simplify this absolute value first, and then we're going to simplify the rest of the parentheses. So we're going to do 35 minus 4 plus 12, and 7 minus 4. 7 minus 4 is 3. So we're going to have that. And the absolute value of 3 is 3. So we're going to do 35 minus 4 plus 12 times 3. And then simplifying these parentheses, we're going to first do 12 times 3. So we're going to have, that's not a good 3. There we go. 35 minus 4. And then 12 times 3 is 36. And then from here, you're going to have 35 minus, and then 4 plus 36 is 40. And then 35 minus 40, that is going to be negative 5. And that is your final answer. And then looking at example 9, we now have a little bit going on, but that's okay. We got this. So we have 2 minus, let's just write it out. Well, let's first see what we're going to do first. So we have these absolute value bars. So we're going to simplify this absolute value first. So we're going to have the absolute value of 2 minus 4, and then negative 4 minus 3 is going to be negative 7. So we're going to have times the absolute value of 7 divided by negative 4 to the 4th power. So now let's find out what the absolute value of negative 7 is. 2 minus 4. And then absolute value of 7 is, negative 7 is 7, because remember, absolute value is always positive. And then we're going to have negative 4 to the 4th. And then now, treating this as a regular order of operations problem, remember, we always do exponents next, because we don't have any more parentheses, because this whole thing is the absolute value of it. And so our next step is going to be finding out what negative 4 to the 4th power is. So I'm just going to write that out here. Well, here, let me say. I'm going to go like this, and then say negative 4 to the 4th equals negative 4 times negative 4 times negative 4 times negative 4. And then I'm not going to do all this mentally. Well, actually, yeah, I'm not going to do it mentally. So if you put that in a calculator, what you will get is 256. And you might be like, why is that positive? If you're thinking that, why is that positive? I encourage you to go to the first module in this course and look at, I think it's section 1.5 when we're dealing with negative numbers to powers of exponents. Because that will go through a whole rule with you where you'll find out that if you have an even exponent, you always get out a positive number. But anyways, so we got that, it's 256. So we get 2 minus 4 times 7 divided by 256. So we now have subtraction, multiplication, and division. So we're gonna do this 4 times 7 first because we have multiplication, division, and when we do that, we're gonna work from left to right. So I'm gonna draw this arrow, this arrow here, so that we can see what we're doing. So we're gonna do 4 times 7. So we're gonna have the absolute value of 2 minus 4 times 7, which is 28. And we're gonna divide that by 256. And we're going to do 28 divided by 256, which that is not a whole number. So I'm going to write this as a fraction. And then now we are subtracting fractions, so we have to find a common denominator. So I'm going to put this 2 over 1, and then I'm going to multiply this whole fraction by 256. Well, I can't say that actually because that's an incorrect way of saying it. So I'm going to multiply this entire, I'm going to multiply the denominator and numerator by 256. So what we'll get is 2 times 256 is 512. I'm going to put that over 256. Then we're going to subtract 28 over 256. Then we can't forget our absolute value bars. So, and then from here, since we have our common denominators, we'll just subtract 512 minus 28, which equals the absolute value of 484 over 256. Now, the absolute value of 484 over 256 is the same. Well, it's 484 over 256. And then we can reduce this fraction by dividing both the numerator and denominator by 4, and then we'll get our final answer, which is 121 over 64. And then you can put that in your calculator, do 121 divided by 64 if you would like to get a decimal. But otherwise, then we are finished with this section.